Hi, you're here sewing with Cody, and here we are in another week's worth of problems and questions and troubleshooting with our sewing machines from customers who have come in, called, text, emailed. So before we dive in and get started, make sure to hit that like button if you liked the video, enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel. It helps you see more videos that come out. And I've been pretty regular about posting these days, but also helps other people see the videos, and also sharing with your friends. Post them on your Facebook pages that you follow. But also check out the merchant shop, which I've got a number of different t-shirts, mugs, and things that with the sale of these items go and help promote, the sale of these items help keep this channel alive and basically helps bring more videos towards the sale of these items. The proceeds from them help support this channel and bring more videos like this. So this week we've got a couple of questions or problems, quite a few actually. So we'll go and start listing some of them. So one of the first came from a customer. She was embroidering, and the top of her design, she was just doing lettering. She was doing monograms, and the embroidery looked beautiful. There was a little bit of puckering, but nothing that was technically out of the ordinary. I've got a picture that I'll show of the back. This is where her issue was. So like I said, the front, the satin stitch looked great, but when she turned over to the back, all she saw was top thread embroidery. All she saw was top embroidery thread. She didn't see her bobbin thread at all. Basically what happened was her top embroidery thread just completely wrapped to the back and met. So what this was showing me was that her tension was completely off. So when I looked at it, I knew it had to do something with the bobbin tension. The top thread tension, even if there was no top thread tension, it wouldn't look like what you see in the picture. So there was a number of things it could have been. Like I said, most likely it was definitely her bobbin case. So what's with the bobbin case is you can have a number of different issues, and this could be a number of different machines. So the bobbin case tension was extremely tight. So what it could have been a number of things. It could have been, and it depends on your bobbin case, it could have been she could have dropped her bobbin case, and what was happening, her bobbin case was no longer perfectly round to match her bobbin, and so that bobbin wasn't spinning as smoothly. It was getting caught on the side of the interior of her bobbin case. That can cause something like that. It can cause other issues too, where the bobbin can't spin as freely. But basically what her issue was, and I'll explain some of the other things that could happen, is the stop spring. So she was sewing on, or she is embroidering on a Bernina 580. So it's using a rotary hook bobbin, as you see here. I'll get a close-up of this. So with a rotary hook, and the same thing we're working with, and this is a rotary style bobbin as well, is with the Q series. So these bobbin cases have stop springs in them. And so what it was, her stop spring was, it had basically come out and twisted. So that stop spring, you see it's a thin metal piece, and what it is it's designed to basically slow down and stop the bobbin from spinning when you stop sewing or stop embroidering. And so what it was in there ajar, as you can see in the picture, and it wasn't allowing the bobbin to spin hardly at all. The bobbin was barely spinning, because she said that she tried a couple of different bobbin threads and it was giving the same result. So when she said that and looking at the picture, I knew it had to do something with the bobbin case, basically the stop spring. So we're going to show a video. I'm going to show you how to make sure that your stop spring is in there correctly, because sometimes when the bobbin case is dropped, that stop string can pop out of there, and if you put it in upside down, it causes other issues. because it's not there to help stop that bobbin from spinning. But also if you put it in there the right way up, but it's not where it needs to be, and it's cockeyed. It can mess up your bobbin sensors, but also it can mess up and cause bobbin tension issues. So let's take a closer look and see how to properly take out and put in that bobbin stop spring. Okay, so here we are with a rotary bobbin case, and this is from like this 200, 730, 560, 580, 460 style machines. So you can see it's narrow, it's got the little latch, and it's got this stop spring. So if this little stop spring ever comes out or gets worn out, because we sell these individually, so if they ever get worn out completely, as you can see, this one's a little worn, but still spring into action. So this is what the stop spring looks like. And you can see this is it laying the correct way. Oop, they're real thin. So the sides should lay nice and flat against the table, or in this case, your bobbin case, and the center part should spring up. If it's laying completely flat on the table, you need a new stop spring because it's not going to work. Also, if you were to put it upside down, it's going to latch to the side and be completely flat and be completely useless. So you want to make sure when you're putting it in there that it's going to lay just like this. So it's designed to fit in this direction. So that's the top, and this is the top of the bobbin case. So we put this in, so if we look on the sides, we see these little holes here on the left side. That's for those two little pegs. And the holes on the right side, the little opening here, that's where these little peg holes are going to go. So when you set it in, and also something else to point out, this little opening here, this is going to be where that little bean opening is on your bobbin case. So I like to put one side in first. So a little stiletto or a little tweezers help. So we want to get those little pegs in this side. You kind of work it and twist it just so it latches in. So that side's in. So we come to this side and just stick that in. Sometimes that side pops out where you're trying to pop that side in. But once you get both sides in, that side of that stop spring should lay nice and flat against the bobbin case. And that's it. So you want to make sure that top part is springing up. But as you saw in the picture, her stop spring was all twisted up. It was still intact, but it was all messed up inside her bobbin case. And she didn't realize it, and that's what was causing her issue. Now, that's not the only thing that can cause that issue. So we also have this little latch. We also see it on our Q-series machines. The same latch we have like on our Gambles and other long arm style machines. So if you notice, these bobbin cases are very similar, just one's much larger than the other. So something else I always encourage customers to do, no matter what style bobbin case they really have, is so once they have their bobbin threaded and they have it in their machine, all of our Bernina machines have a little cutter on the inside, right where you open your little door entering your bobbin case or your bobbin area. So you pull that, once you have your bobbin case in, pull that tail, and when you're pulling it, see how much resistance you have. If you have a lot of resistance pulling that bobbin thread while this is in your machine, if you've got a lot of resistance, something isn't right. Either your bobbin case isn't snapped in all the way, or you have thread caught around somewhere. Same thing, especially for the Q-series, your long arms. Because what can also happen, especially if you have your long arm on the frame, I can't tell you how many times this has happened with ours, is the thread will get caught around this loop. So the thread pulls, but it can be really tight. So you would know this once you've taken your bobbin case, you've put it in your machine, and you go to pull that thread. Even if you're going to leave a tail, like to help pull up that bobbin thread when you're quilting, or if you're going to use your thread cutter, when you pull that tail, if it's really tight, then something's wrong. And this can also cause tension issues quite naturally. It's so easy for this little tail to get caught around this little lever here. So that's something that we see often with the long arms when we're putting the bobbin in, is that we've seen it get caught around this little latch, and it causes nothing but issues once it starts stitching. And the same thing for this, because one of the things that this customer mentioned was she was having issues with the bobbin thread pulling up or starting when she was embroidering. And all it was that stop spring. Because our long arms also have it too. So they just have something a little bit different, but they have a similar stop spring. And what that's designed to do is designed to help that bobbin stop spinning when you stop sewing. Because if you look at your bobbin, it should be bouncy in there. If your bobbin isn't bouncy, then that stop spring is either in wrong or it needs to be replaced. So that was the first thing that our troubleshooting issue that we had this week. So the other question, or another question that I've gotten this week, is it was on the Bernina Q series. It doesn't matter, Q16, Q20, Q24, they're all the same in the way their user interface works. But she was having questions about the BSR. She was using, I'm not quite sure which BSR she was using, if it was mode 1 or 2, but she was confused about when to use which one and what was the difference between each BSR. So I go over this in my BSR video, which I can link it to this video, but I'm more than happy to go over it again because it's a little bit different, especially on the Q series. So there are now on the domestic machines, most of them now, we have 3 different BSR modes, and we have those same ones on the Q16, the Q20, or Q24, our Bernina long arms. So the BSR, first of all, if you're not familiar, the BSR stands for Bernina Stitch Regulator. We're the only company that actually has a digital stitch regulator, so it regulates your stitches as you're quilting, your free motion quilting. So with these machines, we have BSR mode 1. So BSR mode 1 and BSR mode 2, they both regulate your stitches. So you basically tell the machines how close you want your stitches to be, essentially. And you're able to, so once you start moving your fabric, the machine starts stitching. So the faster you move the fabric, the faster it stitches to keep that set stitch length. So on the Q series, it's so many stitches per inch, which is like usually average about 10 or 12 stitches per inch. On the domestic machines, like say your 770, you're going to tell it basically in millimeters like you're used to when you're sewing. So 2 millimeters, you want your stitch length to be 2 millimeters, 2.5 millimeters, so on and so forth. So BSR mode 1, when you turn on the BSR and you start moving your fabric, the machine is going to start stitching. The faster you move it, the faster it's going to stitch. The slower you move it, the slower it's going to stitch. That's the same for both mode 1 and 2. But the difference is with mode 1, when you are moving and you stop moving, you pause for a second, but you still have your BSR on, the machine is still going to stitch very slowly, typically. So on the domestic machine, it's just going to stitch very slowly. On the Q series, you can see in the picture here, we have a little slider. We have the ability to tell the machine how slow or how fast the machine will stitch when it's not detecting any fabric or quilt movement. That's what that little bar is on the picture. This is something that we cannot change on our domestic sewing machines, but something that we can change on the Q series. So with BSR mode 1, the biggest takeaway here is when you stop moving the fabric and the BSR is on, the machine is still going to slowly stitch. So what's great about this, especially on the domestic machine like the 770, is the machine is always stitching. So the machine is always in motion. So I always find when you start moving again, especially if you start a little quicker than the machine was ready, the machine is more ready to start stitching and start regulating those stitches. Because with BSR mode 2, it works the same way up until the point when you pause. So BSR mode 2, this works the same for the domestic, is when you stop moving your quilt, the machine pauses. It stops stitching. But it does keep that needle up. So when you start moving your fabric again, it starts to stitch again. However, Now, on the Q series, the machine's so quick and so intuitive, I usually don't have this issue. But on the domestic, the machine isn't quite as fast as the Q series. So with domestic, with using BSR mode 2, when I pause for a second and I start moving again, that machine has to, one, recognize that I started moving the fabric, and then it has to start stitching. So I find that first stitch or two right after I've paused is much longer than it should be. It's much longer than I want it to be, because if you start moving it, that machine then has to bring that needle down after it recognizes that it started to move the fabric, and then that first stitch or two is just longer than it should be. So this is personally why I like BSR mode 1. For that reason. It's always ready to go, ready to start stitching. It's also nice because if you're doing free motion quilting designs that have points that kind of come to a point, like a little flame, like a little flame on a fire. So you kind of come up and it has a point and you come back down. So with BSR mode 2, I can come up, pause for a second, the machine will take an extra stitch in that spot, and then I can start moving again. So when I paused, the machine wasn't thinking about stopping. The machine was just thinking, I still need a stitch. Slowly, but I still need to take an extra stitch or two. And then you can start moving again. It's a BSR mode 3, and BSR mode 3 is still stitch regulated, but BSR mode 3 is a basting stitch. So we see this with the 770 Plus and the upgrade 770 to the Plus. I think those are currently the only ones that have it. At least depending on the time you watch this video. But it has BSR mode 3, and the Q series have had it for years. And BSR mode 3 is just a basting stitch. You can tell it 1 stitch per inch, 2 stitches per inch, and 4 stitches per inch. So if you're basting down the edge of your quilt, or if you're doing some basting on the quilt to go back and hand stitch it or something like that, that's what BSR mode 3 is. Most of the time when you are quilting, it's BSR mode 1 or BSR mode 2. And I've got, like I said, I've got some BSR videos going in more detail of working with the BSR. So the last question was a comment on one of the videos. So I did go into detail and explain the difference to the customer, but I'm going to bring this to everyone else. So the question was, and I wrote it down so I can read it exactly, or paraphrase it. She was working on a 9mm stitch width machine. She didn't say exactly which one. And she was using either the 37 or the 57D foot. And her issue was, when she was piecing her quilt, the fabric or the thread would more or less jam up when she started from the edge of the fabric. And she wanted some advice to help easily start sewing from the edge of the fabric using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you're not familiar, the 37 foot and the 57 foot are 1/4 inch feet. They're designed for making 1/4 inch seam allowances. So she was starting from the edge of the fabric, and the thread was jammed or bunching up. The fabric could have gotten eaten up by the machine. It just wasn't feeding was her biggest issue. And so there's a number of things, and I'll show you, but there are a number of things that can cause this issue, or basically that can fix this issue. So the first thing, for starters, and I'll be perfectly honest, when it comes to these machines and everything, I love them to death, but nothing's perfect, and no company is perfect. The first issue is the foot. So when 9mm stitch width machines came out, which the first one for Bernina was the 1630 in 1994. So it was the first 9mm stitch width machine. 9mm stitch width sewing is absolutely amazing, unless you're piecing, unless you're doing really delicate stitching, especially with really narrow seam allowances and with more delicate fabric. The machine just eats it. It can be a mess. So there's a number of things we can fix with this, but my gripe, which they have fixed this issue, my gripe is, so since 1994, it wasn't until about 5 years ago did they come out with a 1/4 inch foot that can accommodate that 9mm stitch width. So I've got a video on the 97 foot. There's a 97 and a 97D. The D is what you should use for your dual feed machines. So the issue with the 37, the 57, like I said, I go into more detail in that video, is their narrow feet, even the D feet. So from the center of the needle to the right and the left side of both of these feet are 1/4 inch, which makes this foot tiny. So these machines with their 9mm stitch width, like a lot of our machines are, those feed dogs are really spaced out. So those tiny little pieces of the feed dogs that go in, and that's all that's coming in contact with your foot when using the 57 and 37. So they eventually, like I said, just 5 years ago, came out with the 97 foot. So the 97 foot is one side, which is the right side of the foot. I had to think for a second. The right side of the foot, from the center of the needle to the right side of the foot, is 1/4 inch. That's all we need, is for the right side of the foot to be 1/4 inch, because the majority of our fabric is always to the left side. So the left side of the foot is significantly wider to grab a hold of that fabric and help it feed through. So that's the first thing that can make a huge difference, is when you're piecing on a 9mm stitch width machine, is to use the 97 or the 97D. If you have the dual feed, use the 97D. If you don't have a machine with dual feed, say like a 580 or a 560 or the 1630, except that one they don't make a 97 foot for that machine. If you don't have a machine that has a dual feed, use the regular 97. That's why there's 2 different ones. So that's the first thing that can definitely help feeding the fabric, hands down. Makes all the difference in the world. The other thing was to make sure you're using the straight stitch plate. That makes a huge difference too, because anything bigger than a straight stitch plate, the fabric is just going to eat, the machine is just going to eat up the fabric, just because it just wants to be pushed down in there, especially if you're piecing a quilt. That makes a huge difference. Now, the biggest thing that I suggested to her, because it didn't sound like she had a 97 foot, is to use a leader fabric. This is something that people have used for years and years and years, no matter what brand of machine or whatever. So a leader fabric, which I'll show you, is just a little piece of scrap fabric, at least 2 layers. And a lot of times people just cut like a little 1.5, 2-inch square fabric, and they just stitch over and over and over again, just keep using it. But a leader fabric, what you would do is you would start on that fabric, typically somewhere in the center. So you're not worried about starting on the edge. You're not worried about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You just stick it right under the foot, and then you're going to start on that fabric, and then you're going to lead off of that fabric onto your main fabric. And especially if you're chain piecing, where you're kind of just piecing one after another and kind of keeping those stitches connected, makes a huge difference too, because it has another piece of fabric to lead off of. The leader fabric helps tremendously feed fabric, the thread, and everything, and you almost never have an issue. So those 3 things will help if you're having feeding issue when working with like piecing your quilt or delicate fabric or working with a tiny seam allowance. So the leader, the 0mm stitch plate, if you're using a straight stitch in the center needle position, and make sure you tell your machine. And also make sure if you're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance to use the 97 or the 97D foot when working with a 9mm stitch width machine. Otherwise, a 5.5mm stitch width machine, the 57 and 37 are perfect. There's no need for the 97. So here we are. So we want to make sure we take off that 9mm because stitch plate. Can you see that big opening? It's just going to eat our fabric when working with a 1/4 inch seam. So we're going to put on the 0mm stitch plate, or your straight stitch plate. You can see there's just enough space for that needle to penetrate. Make sure you always tell the machine. So as I was mentioning before, so here are some of our other 1/4 inch feet. So you can see how narrow they are. So this is the regular 57. So from the center of the needle to the left and to the right side of the foot is a 1/4 inch, and it's just not gonna cover those feed dogs. So here is a 57D with the guide removed. So here you can see how narrow this foot is. Look at all those feed dogs on the left side where all your fabric is. It's not coming in contact with your foot at all. You've got these tiny little feed dogs right there on the inside and back here, and the little guy in the back, and that's it. This is why this foot is not the best when it comes to doing 1/4 inch seams on a 9mm stitch width machine. So here is the 97. So you can see the 97 foot is much wider on the left side, where all of your fabric is always located, and narrower on the right side. I was bad and I removed the guide from the 57D and put it on my 97D. Not recommended by Bernina, but. So here you can see how this foot is completely covering the feed dogs on the left side. This is why you use a 97 foot when using a 9mm stitch width machine. And on the right side of the foot is a beautiful 1/4 inch. And of course, always make sure that you engage your feed dogs. I'm sorry, your dual feed. So now the leader fabric. So here's just a piece of fabric left over from the shirt that I'm actually wearing right now. So what you would do is you would just start in the beginning, in the center of the fabric. And so I've got 2 layers, always recommend 2 layers. So you start wherever it's easy. And so you just start sewing. And then you can easily lead on to this here. Get that nice perfect 1/4 inch. And you can chain piece, you can do as many as you need. So when you are done, then you just take your little snips and then you can snip off this leader. So you didn't have any problems. Perfect seam. This was just scrap, obviously. So that's how a leader fabric works, and that will eliminate, and that definitely will eliminate that customer's issue, is by using a leader. Otherwise, you can still. So there is one more thing I forgot to mention. She was explaining her issue was that her thread was also getting pulled underneath. Hold your tail. So if you're also having issues, because sometimes working with more delicate fabrics or whatever, you're not doing this too often. So I will leave an extra long tail under here. And then you can take the extra steps to pull up that bobbin thread, just like we are when we're quilting. So when you start sewing, and this is something I recommend all the time, is hold those tails. Don't allow those tails to be free, because the machine will suck them up and they will get all jammed up underneath your fabric, create a little nest, just not pretty. So when you start sewing, always just hold my hand here. And so when I start sewing, I don't allow this thread to ever get sucked up underneath the machine. So that's something else you can do, is hold those tails when you first start. All right, so those were the 3 main troubleshooting issues and questions that we've gotten this week, at least so far. So I hope that if you ever do encounter these issues, this video helped you rectify your problem or saw where the issue occurred. And if you've had these issues before in the past, then now if you didn't figure out what happened or why, hopefully now you understand better about what was going on and what happened. All right, so remember, if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, check out the merchant shop, and happy sewing.